Well, good morning, students. Hope everybody has had a good night rest. And I'm going to underscore that statement because today we're going to be using our biceps and quadriceps and triceps and trapezius muscles and abdomen muscles and calves like we've never used them before. So this is going to be one of the most strenuous days in the entire project. And it is lesson 16, beams and trusses. And I have to have a full disclaimer here. I've installed every beam in my home. I've cut them, I've hewn them, I've connected them, and I had to use a little ingenuity in some instances of walking up a step ladder with one side of the beam on my shoulder, as the other side I have already placed into the beam pocket in the gable, which you will see in some of these clips that I have in this video here. So, and not to mention another, tidbit here is, with a certified architecture plan, I totally recommend you students getting one because they will depict every screw, every bolt, the depth of the footer, the width of the footer, the type of concrete, the beams, the beam placement, how far they're spaced apart. So essentially you have a schematic of building your off-grid retreat based on a certified architect, which if it's built to specifications, then he or takes all liability. So what I'm trying to say is, I know there's some people out where I live who have built their own homes and it looks like a bomb hit the home, but I stress the fact to use a certified architect because he has already calculated load-bearing walls, loads, structures, pitches of roofs, gulam beams which go through the center of the home to hold up the entire structure. I don't think that any of us, including me, could actually come up with all of those calculations because we are not certified architects. So anyhow, tools and equipment: hammer, nails, square, circular saw, jigsaw, chalk line, chalk, tool belt with ample supplies, cordless screw gun, wood screw, chainsaw, sharpened blade. That's important. I had to sharpen my chainsaw blade a few times. I was using it so much. Movable lift, step ladder, extension ladder, blueprints, which I just discussed, and proper attire and footwear. Ever think you can install 300-pound beams 16 feet in the air all by yourself? Did you ever think that you could install the other prescribed heavy log home beams into their respective beam pockets and make it done like the professionals all by yourself? Have you ever thought that you could install trusses for a log home for your ceiling? Well, I did all of this, and I want to give a quick warning here. If this is something that you cannot tackle by yourself, remember I'm very healthy, athletic build, and I had the requisite mental outlook that I could do this 100%. Remember, you're going to invest a lot of time and treasure into this project, and you want to make sure that you can do these items and not try them out. If you try something out, students, and you fail, you could cause more severe damage, not only to your project, but also injury to yourself or even death. And I am not responsible for anybody's injuries or death in this matter. So please understand your limitations before taking this on. Step 1, planning the milestone. So you're going to uncover your waterproof packaging around your log packages outside on your job site. One is going to be marked beams. Luckily, the log home manufacturing company labeled each individual beam for ease of selection and installation. So you just have to identify the beam and then bring it into your work area. And then you look at your schematic, which is your certified architect plans, and you will notice where the beam goes in the exact beam pocket. It's that easy. Step 2, preparing the beams. Use your rolling lift scaffold and park it into place right under your loft area. Swing one side of the beam onto the lift and then the other side up onto it. You're going to need a rolling scaffold in the highest position, which for me it was 8 feet, students. Swing one side of the beam over onto the scaffold. You must swing more than half of the beam over onto the pad of the scaffold, or else it will go crashing down into the floor, and it could actually go into your basement floor if it goes through the subfloor. You don't want to do that. Now push the beam all the way up onto the rolling scaffold. Remember, the scaffold is locked. It's got brakes on each one of the wheels. So you got 4 wheels, there's 4 brakes. It'll actually stay in place. Climb up onto the rolling scaffold. Now lift one end of the beam up onto the subfloor loft area. Slide it onto the floor of your loft until it is positioned correctly to remove the scaffold. Tip: you want to be very careful that you do not slip off the scaffold or tip it over with these heavy beams. In addition, be sure to depress all 4 brakes, as I said before. And again, students, if you're not apt to doing this, please get a contractor or a professional company to install these beams. Once again, I didn't have any help where I lived because it was so remote. People would not drive out. I'm talking about the handyman helpers that you would find word of mouth. These construction companies, I solicited a few and entertained a few bids, but when they come in at $300,000 to stack beams and logs, and the log package is 1/10 that price, I decided it was, it's time to do all this myself, which is beneficial because now I can tell my kids and grandkids that, I did this by myself and it was done with love for them, and and then also you also have privacy too, that you've built your own off-grid retreat, that where all the beams are, all the nails, all the spikes, everything that's done. You can modify the home in the future date because it's behind the interior wall panels. Okay, so repeat this process with all the beams needed to install. You can look at my video here and see. Once the beams are up according to specifications in the loft area, you are safe and secure when the beams are secure. You will make measurements as you go, cut them to length. I used a chainsaw for the cutting, but you can also use a circular saw as long as you make 2 cuts. You have to cut on both sides, students. And the other thing too, the chainsaw is kind of like playing an instrument. You're not probably going to be too good at it the first time you use a chainsaw. You might need to take some practice wood and actually practice with the chainsaw. Even cutting a straight line down on a beam is difficult with a chainsaw if you're not familiar on how a chainsaw works. And then sometimes you need to cut bevels and curves. So I would recommend using a circular saw if you have issues with a chainsaw. You just have to cut one side and then make sure the blade is deep enough to cut the other side. So step 3, hoisting the beams. On my plans, it required to insert 10-foot tall wooden posts to the center of the loft floor in order to stabilize the butting of the 2 overhead beams. I think I mentioned 16 feet earlier. That was what the original plan said, student. I actually changed the original plans and I used 10 feet because I wanted to maintain the inside of the home. Make sure I could, just with a small step stool, I could get and dust things and maybe revarnish things and things like that. So I didn't want a 16-foot ceiling on my loft. However, from the great room bottom floor, it is over 16 feet high, but that's 2 stories. The post would be there for life of the home, and it's a nice finish with knotty pine wood beams standing vertical in your loft area. It still looks good to this day. And in fact, the wood products from the log home manufacturing really made the project come alive with fancy designs, arcing ceilings, dawning beams, and woodworking, giving it that 16th century cathedral look. Just what I wanted. So make sure you plan things the way you want them. The next step will require a step ladder. What I did was place one end of the beam into the outside beam pocket of the upper gable, then move the ladder over to the 10-foot tall post 16 feet over. And you notice that the beam is on an angle because I needed to bend down, hoist it up onto my shoulder, and walk up the ladder. Make sure you have a sturdy enough ladder to do this. At this point, you will place the beam onto the pole and then grab two 20-inch screws from your pouch, screw them into the beam on both sides, onto the top of the post, and repeat this process for the other gable. The other gable was smaller, and I actually built a scaffold because there's an opening over the great room, and I had that scaffolding up for a few years, and it really did its job for me. I could, paint and do woodworking and everything right from the scaffold, and install those windows as well. So repeat this process until you get all of the beams in their pockets and also screwed down and secured, and then we will go into the trusses of the ceiling soon. Each one of these beams were the heaviest, as I discussed earlier. There were two massive ones over the wings where the bedrooms are, and then another two massive beams over the great room, which connected in the center. For these beams to be installed, again, I used the moving scaffold and had to use my engineering knowledge and understand fulcrum points, and raise up one beam and level it onto the moving scaffold, and get up onto the moving scaffold and lift that up onto the loft floor and push that in to make sure it doesn't tip back onto the scaffold. And so all of this was very nicely done in a fun way to end the day with beams and structures that are very secure, that you could even do pull-ups on. Warning, this is extremely dangerous, and I don't recommend doing this yourself. I took extreme caution moving beams, using chainsaws, installing beams over my head. If you rush through this and a beam falls through the floor, it can not only damage your home, but also could be very detrimental in your own injury. So now that these massive hunks of wood dub beams are in place, your home is much sturdier, and now it's locked into place and your gables are secure. Step 4, installing ceiling trusses. Don't take too much time admiring your work, because you need to start laying out your roof rafters. Again, from your certified architect plan, students, you're going to find out that everything is laid out for you. My ceiling trusses were 6 inches deep, 4 inches wide, and about 14 feet in length. So I just laid them out and I cut them into place. Everything is wrapped in waterproof, weatherproof tarp from your log home company, and they label everything. So this would be labeled trusses. Then I hoisted up the beams, which are much lighter, by the way, the same way as I did the heavy beams, which supported the home and the roof. I used a rolling scaffold in the same way, and then of course put one end onto the scaffold, and then made sure that it was balanced, and then got up onto the scaffold, put it up onto the great room floor in the loft area, and then pushed it onto the floor to balance it so it wouldn't tip backwards. And then I made all of my cuts up there, and remember that there are an angle to your roof. The pitches of the roof, if you've got a 12-12 roof, it's going to be a 45-degree angle. I had a 12-6 roof, which is a 22.5 degree angle, which had to be done. And then at the same time, I had to cut the bottom notch. It's kind of a sawtooth that kind of hooked into the logs themselves, and it kind of gave it that snug outlook of the beam itself. So I did six beams at a time, loaded up 6 onto my truck, used a chainsaw at the cutting site. I properly designed a template to get me that 22.5 degree pitch at the top, and then the sawtooth cut at the bottom. And of course you have to fire up the generator because you don't have electricity. And I used a corded saw for the sawtooth angular cuts at the top, and then at the bottom I used the chainsaw to make the other cut as well. So tip, in order to cut these beams accurately, I used a 2x8 board as a template, and it was cut to the proper length, and I had proper angles on both sides of the beam at the sawtooth and actually the pitch of the roof. And again, it's much easier going off of a template, but you have to measure every truss, because it may, some of these may be off a little bit, a quarter inch here, a half inch there. They need to be longer by a quarter inch or half inch. Not everything's perfect when you're building things, but make sure you do your measurements on all of them before you make these cuts. So before you install these trusses, you have to have a top plate. You remember the sill plate for the basement wall, which your house sits on? Well, you have a top plate on top of your logs in which your trusses will sit on. And at this point, pick one side, maybe the master bedroom wing, and what you want to do is install around the entire perimeter of the logs that were stacked a top plate, and then lay out your 6 trusses on each side. And then they're already cut the length, and then you're going to pull out an 8-inch screw from your pouch, climb to the top, and secure the angular portion of the cross beam with the 8-inch screw through the massive beam that you installed in the beginning of this video. So for me, these trusses needed to be spaced every 34 inches on center. So consult your blueprint, as it might be different for you. Once one side of the trusses are complete, go to the other side, and you want to make sure that they're lined up exactly. It gives it more strength. And your beams are plumbed and straight, and of course they won't be leveled because they're going to be angled down. And once you're done, take a step back, admire your work. And this really was a beautiful portion of the project, as you can see from the photograph here. And it's a beautiful scene when you're done, drinking a nice Coke with, eating a bratwurst and admiring your work. And of course, you're probably still filthy and dirty, full of sawdust, but a little sawdust on your hamburger really makes it taste healthy when you know that you did the work yourself. So in closing, be sure to click the thumbs up button below, and subscribe to the channel here, students. And again, write your papers, and I don't need to see them. And Godspeed, and we'll see you in the next video.